Yes, well, bonjour and good morning. Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm truly honored to be here. It's a highly symbolic event, and I'm really honored to have the pleasure to kick off your summer school. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm a bit sorry that I can't really see your faces. You have to deal with my back though, but I hope that's kind of all right. It's a very particular setting, but I think it's very good that we can later on have a discussion, and you wanted to avoid a kind of a frontal interaction.
The chairs, because the idea was that everybody would sit around the X-shaped table, and then everybody would sit there and look at the presentation.
But look, I think it's excellent because from the very start, people declare their own independence and sit wherever they want. So that's absolutely all right. I just hope that we can interact later on a bit better. So, well, thank you again. I have some experience in working across disciplines, and I find that extremely important, in particular when it comes to topics like urban studies, migration and architecture, because I think it makes absolutely no sense just to stick in your own box. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity here to open up the space. So the aim of my talk is to show you a bit what kind of contribution social anthropology can make to that topic. This is kind of what I try to outline, and then you will see if there are issues that you are interested in, that you can think, well, this is something I haven't thought about before, or this I find inspiring, or that you say, well, I don't agree at all with this kind of approach. So I try to give you a bit of a broader scope of how social anthropologists conceive of migration, and I will give you also some examples what that means on the ground when I finish up my presentation. So this is just about more or less what I intend to do. And as you have already heard in the introduction, I worked a long time, and I'm still working in Mexico. And you know, Mexico shares that endless border with the US, and there are a lot of parallels that we can observe between those issues in the US-Mexican context and comparing that now with Europe. That's very, very enlightening too. But of course there are also differences in that regard. But I also would like to mention that a lot of theoretical concepts, like all the transnational discussion, for instance, were developed along this Mexican-US border. And there is already a political reason, because a lot of research money was and still is available for this border issue, because there is a high political interest. So you already see in a conceptual view the linkages between science, politics, and our discussions. You know, they are not taking place in a kind of a vacuum, they're all already politically loaded. So I would like to start off with a bit of a broader context, what actually social anthropology is, what do we do, and how do we perceive of our research study. And one of our main interests is that we try to capture the other's point of view, as we say. So we really try to understand how groups and individuals look at the world and how they give meaning to their daily praxis. How do they understand what they actually do? This is our aim, and this is of course quite a challenge, because to understand the other, you need to apply particular methods. And one of our biggest identity marker in anthropology is the ethnographic approach that we apply. And this includes what we call field work and participant observation. So we also do interview, oral history, we also apply cognitive methods, but the most important methodology that we use is that we stay a long period of time in the field, usually kind of 12 months. We cover a whole year cycle, and we try not only to observe but to engage and interact with the participants that we work with in order to understand their perception of the world. So we explore ethnographically how people attach meaning to their environment. And then in the second step of what we would call ethnography, we try to give a language to the processes that we observe. That sounds obvious, but it is actually not, because our main aim is to make visible practices that you take for granted. So we try to dig a bit deeper into the way people give meaning to their lives by carving out the knowledge that they have, but that they do not articulate. So things that you take for granted, you don't speak about it, you just do it because this is how it was always done, or this is part of your family tradition or whatever, but you do not necessarily reflect on it, or you do not necessarily verbalize this. So we try to get hold of this kind of knowledge that we call tacit knowledge, that is kind of not so much talked about, but this is visible in your practices. And that is why it is so important for us to have the chance to come up with participant observation in order to get hold of this kind of set of knowledge that we try to carve out. Then we always consider, and I think that's really important, our own positionality. That means we do not gather data in that sense that like we pick data like fruit from the trees or berries from the bushes. So we do not believe that there is a reality out there that we observe. But our approach is different. We think that we construct the reality by interacting with our participants. So we kind of reject a positivist approach to what is real, but we try to reflect on our own interactions that we have to the people, because we believe strongly that this is how we shape what we kind of do together. So we should bear that in mind, because I think that's quite an important approach in our discipline, that we, when we talk of gathering data, we don't really mean we believe in that type of reality, but we believe in a more constructivist approach. And of course there are then a lot of ethical issues and power relation involved, but I don't need to go into that now. Further, I want to point out that we use a holistic approach. So that means that we are always contextualizing what we do and what we see in a broader set of global forces, of globalization, of economic forces, or of political reconfiguration. Nothing just happens in the vacuum. It is always shaped by a broader context. And what we try to do with our work is that we try to carve out the linkages and interrelationships that exist between people's beliefs, life worlds, social practices, and these broader contexts, considering our own positionality as researcher. So this is kind of how I could sum up more or less what I would think is our approach. All right. Let's move on now a bit, how we deal with migration, because that probably interests you, or I would like to give you a bit of an insight how we approach this topic. And as you heard already in the introduction, I do have a strong interest in spatial issues, and that may link me to what you are interested in. So I think we all agree that you can't really separate physical space and social space. They are always interwoven. And this should become also very evident in what I will say in the following. But before I go into more details, I also would like to problematize the notion of migration or of migrant, and really point to the fact that this is a very broad category where a lot of different facets of people, of borders, of political regimes are lumped together. And we have to be aware that this is, of course, not a homogeneous category. So we always have to deconstruct, and we always have to bear in mind what precisely are we talking of, or to whom do we refer when we speak of migrants? Is that refugees, asylum seekers, elite migrants, or what have you? So it's really a very, very broad category, and there are some people in my work who actually refuse to be called migrants. So if you deal with, you could say, elite migrants, expatriate people who move around a lot and who are always on the move, they would refuse to be called a migrant, because the term is so loaded in a quite negative way. So we also have to bear that in mind, I would think.
So what do they want?
Expats, expatriates. So people coin their own terms, their own terminology, you know, because they forge their own identities, and they kind of reject being lumped together in a category that they don't agree with. All right, yeah, so I will go on and talk a bit more now about this conception of migration, and I would like to stress that we perceive of migration as a cross-cutting, as a non-linear movement, as an ongoing process, as a starting point. So not so much as a movement from place A to place B, as something that is kind of very linear and that is even predictable, but we perceive as migration as a particular pathway that people navigate through, which is again shaped by the broader context. And because it is non-linear, and I'm not so sure if it has a starting and an end point to be open, I sometimes struggle a bit with a word that popped up already a lot with the term of arrival city. Maybe we can discuss that later on, if this is adequate or not. I struggle with that a bit, but this is just a sideline to mention. So we perceive migration as a transnational way of life, as a lifestyle. And this is a very particular approach. It really struggles with that notion there is a beginning and an end. There is something more ongoing. We stress the process and, again, the non-linear that is inherent in transnational migration. And, of course, there comes my Mexican-US experience in where people go back and forth across that border a lot. And as I already mentioned, this concept of transnationalism was coined along that border because it is so prominent there. But I'm, of course, aware of the fact that that doesn't mean that it is prominent everywhere. There are different shades of how we can perceive of migration, but I think this is quite an interesting pathway that we should go. And this notion, of course, has several theoretical implications. It means that we have to let go of methodological nationalism or the expectation that social life logically and automatically takes place within the borders of a nation state. And it also needs that migrants connect and transform places and localities that they move through. So it's not a movement that leaves no traces. It is a movement that creates a lot of linkages and has a strong performative and transformative power as well. All right, it has also other implications, but maybe I can explain that a bit further in a discussion when we speak of culture and society and nation. And in the media and also in some literature, those three concepts, which I see as different, are often equated. A nation is not a society, and a society is not culture. So we have to be aware of those categories as well, but very often they are used as synonyms, which I don't think that this is correct. Then we have a strong trans-border movement. So it's not just transnational, it is also trans-border. And I would like to stress that. You think it's obvious, but I think it is not, because the term border does not just refer to a physical border, it also refers to a social border. So these movements implies border in a very, trans-border in a very, very broad sense. There are multiple borders that migrants cross on their journey. So for instance, you have a language border, you have borders that are strongly racialized, you have gender, class, ethnicity, religion. There are many borders that you have to consider when we speak of a trans-border movement. So one layer is the more physical, geographical aspect of it, but the other one is the social one that we have to bear in mind when we speak of trans-border concepts. Again, I already mentioned this transformative power, and I think that's quite important when we speak about space and social issues. So places become connected and influenced by each other. And I found that concept of Irasabal that was developed in 2014 quite helpful. She speaks of the plurality of theirs. So you can't really separate here and there because migrants make those connections, and by moving those spaces they transform it. So her argument, which I find compelling, is that you find always fragments of the theirs in the heres and the other way around. And there are very good examples where you could apply that concept as a kind of an assemblage of here and there spanning. It's a multi-locally concept, basically. So you have fragments of here's and there's on each side, right? And that also shows us that spaces and places are very much interwoven, and also there is a simultaneity of connections. So it's not a sequence. I move from A to B and I have a time and a space sequence that I can follow through. Rather, there are different layers that interact with each other. So the theirs in that concept I find quite nice, because it also brings together the time and the spatial aspect at once. And I think this is another layer that we have to consider, that we shouldn't think of this in a kind of a sequential, a series, but as a process that happens at once, and that, of course, makes it quite complicated. I should give you maybe one example at that stage that is not so dry theoretical. Maybe you are aware of the impact of remittances. Do you all know what remittances are? The money migrants send back to their home country, which is very important. It's in many countries far more money than developing aid, for instance, that is generated by this north and south divide. And remittances in the housing market I found highly interesting, because the housing market is strongly influenced by this notion of the theirs. How people decorate their houses, how they change housing style, the new forms of aesthetics that come into play are reflected in this housing market. And the real estate market is strongly influenced by remittances. People do have some money, others don't. So it also creates new forms of social exclusion, because not everybody has a still successful migration biography, of course. And these biographies are reflected in, for instance, house styles. You know, that's a very common feature. And housing, I also think, is a very interesting topic, because it's much more than the built environment, because a lot of other aspects go along with it, like senses of belonging, identity, and so forth. So using those concepts and applying those to, for instance, the real estate market, I find quite enlightening. You could get a lot out of those aspects, I would say. So just one example, how that could be applied in practice. All right, let's move on, because time is already running. Migration is, of course, also a social process. I also mentioned that. So let's look at this just a bit closer. That people move not only through space, but through a range of social layers. I already mentioned that when we spoke about the trans-border issue. But there is, of course, another aspect that I find quite striking, that then often has to do with a lot of identity struggles that play out quite prominently in the media. Many people struggle with social status on their migration journey. That means usually if we have this south-north migration, at least, people lose social status. They might have a much higher social status in their country of origin, where they're coming from, and lose a lot of status on their journey. And that does something with you, that affects you, that you have to deal with that, you know. That is something that is not so easy to address, to articulate, but that's something, a process that doesn't happen in one day, but it's quite an important aspect. So we have to consider those social layers that people also cross when they move through space. And again, let's refer back to the border issue, which I find quite important, because those processes are often racialized and relate back to what we said about the border, because the migrants' bodies often are marked by the border. So it's not so much the status of citizenship, but it is something that is deep embodied in your performance that decides over belonging and exclusion, which, for example, is conveyed by your physical appearance or by your skin color. So if you cross the border, it doesn't mean that you get rid of the border. because the border is kind of inscribed in yourself. You take it kind of with you, you know, because your body is strongly marked by this border. And it's not only something negative. If you think of elite migrant context, it can be something very positive because it adds to your social capital. If you move from the global north to the global south, as many elite migrants do, because whiteness is associated with privilege, power, and knowledge. So that type of border that you bring with you could be also an asset. So it works in both ways, but my point is that once you cross a border, you haven't really crossed, you haven't really made it, you know, it's still there. So you still have to deal with that. And of course, as I already mentioned, we have to consider the wider context in which these processes happen, and that brings us back to the holistic approach that I mentioned in my very first words. And I really would like to stress that because this wider context shapes your navigation and your pathway as a migrant. And obviously not all countries have the same policies, so depending where you are, where you have to move through, makes quite a big mark on your journey. And on the other hand, this is now just a bit of a side, but I still want to mention it. There are a lot of media representation that go along with it, how people move through cities and how cities move this, use this movement as social capital or not. So it depends really a lot, and that could bring us back to the notion of arrival city maybe later on in that discussion. So, but in spite of a lot of different contexts, there are also common depictions of migrants in the media. And I would like to point out another issue here that, well, now the so-called refugee crisis, you have seen those pictures over and over. I'm sure it gained a lot of focus in the media, and migrants are construed, mediated, and those pictures are circulated to create those compelling representations of refugeehood. But they serve a variety of agendas and conform to specific identities and expectations. So they are, in one sense, a kind of performances. So we note that when we speak of migrations and of the border, it is not only to keep people out, like to keep those physical bodies out. It is also about keeping otherness out, and that refers to a range of different things like pollution, disease, religion, ideas. So it's not just about the physical bodies and the people who come in, but it is also about a range of other issues. So the fences that are built are not just to keep people out. They serve multiple other means as well, and they kind of convey this fear of difference and of the others. And I think that's also why the state creates a range of different categories. All right, I would like to move on now and to look a bit more to what is happening on the ground, and what does this issue do with people. And I would like to make one point really strong, and this is the linkages between migrants and non-migrants. So let's look a bit at those interactions and at the consequences that migration flow in that regard actually has. So I have one more a bit theoretical point, but then we kind of can relax about that a bit more. So I would like to stress one point, which is the formation of ethical subjects and processes of subjectivation by drawing on Foucault in that regard. So what I do is I look at what is happening on the ground. How do citizens react to the migration crisis, if you want? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll do this. Thank you. Attentive, very attentive student, thank you. So what is going on the ground? And I would like to talk about this just for some minutes. And again, I draw on Foucault in order to talk about subjectivation processes and ethics. And I have a bit of a longer quote here in order to bring that theoretical message across. And I would understand ethics primarily as the ways individuals engage with moral codes and how they inform themselves in relation to images of socially legitimated and the normative good behavior. So an ethical being would reflect basically on the fact, how should I deal with that crisis? What is it that we should do? What is an ethical way to do? And the subjectivation process refers to what Foucault here says, that it's an individual who work intentionally on themselves to comply or not with a specific conduct, resulting in a process of subjectivation, a self-constitution or self-forming activity to become a moral being. So how do you position yourself towards this refugee crisis? And of course, this is a very pluralistic effort. You might have your opinion, I have mine. But by discussing about it, by dealing with it, we become kind of political citizens. We become aware of things that we have been not aware. We kind of decide to engage in some kind of activism network, for instance, that we have not done before. So this, I say now crisis in quotes, of course, has some indications that are, I would say, side effects and that were not intended politically at all. So the big question is, how should one deal with refugees, if you want, at the moment, in particular in Germany? So migration mobilizes and impacts on the creation of citizenship and subjectivation in that sense that Foucault has outlined. So residents start to care not only for themselves, but also for the other. This has now a positive spin, as you realize, but it can turn also against what you would like to call citizenship rights. You know, so the Pegida movement, for instance, would also comply with this framework, even so they have very particular norms and values that they refer to. So look at those pictures that were very prominent in the press. So you perform your citizenship to a global audience. Say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here. This was, for instance, a strong message a year ago that was sent out from the famous Hauptbahnhof, from the main station in Munich, where I'm from. And I can assure you it was a very, very particular situation in that moment when citizens really took action and enacted citizenship, as Engen Ischen, for instance, would call that. And the interesting thing here, now speaking of Munich, where I kind of lived through those period, was that it wasn't in line with the politicians' view, because they were far less welcoming than the citizens were. It's not like that anymore, probably, but that was the case at that stage, and I think that triggered even more acts of, if you want, positive citizenships at that moment. And I think it also had a strong impact far beyond Munich. Other examples are when citizens tried to teach refugees about their rights. They kind of, first of all, have to educate themselves, because they didn't know that before either. And there are a lot of other movements that we could mention here. In Berlin, the big one, My Right is Your Right, is another kind of initiative that tries to embrace these issues. There are a lot of anti-border camps where acts of citizens and citizenships are carried out. So there is an empowering moment that is going on the ground in all directions, in positive directions, in welcoming directions, but also in other directions, in ways that make sure we don't want to have a multicultural society, and that's why I go out on the street. No, this is the other side of the coin, but this would also fall into that category that people become active. All right, another point is, and that brings me to my last example, it's, which I find really interesting and relates very much to my research at the moment. It's about security and fear. And there is a lot of talk now in the media and in the press about terrorism and migrant crisis. And so you have to be aware that there is some real big danger in what is going on at the moment, and people have to be vigilant. And this form of security of public space, security of your private life, those security issues, I think, are highly pertinent at the moment. And I just want to give you one example, that it is impossible to control, if you wish, this migrant flow. The state is unable to do so. So in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is not a too bad newspaper in Germany, I have the data here, it was said in February this year, that 100,000 of the registered refugees just vanished from the radar. Nobody knows where they are. They're just gone. They wander off. Nobody knows. So the state is unable to control the people. And that causes a lot of anxieties from the state point of view, because, well, where are they? 100,000, and this is in a functioning German admin system, you know, that they are so proud of. They have to admit we are unable to do it. We don't know where they are. So that means literally each 10th registered refugee is somewhere and nobody knows where. So that now triggers other kinds of action from above and from below. And this is why I think that's quite an important point. So it relates now to the privatization of security. People are aware of that and think, well, how can I feel safe? And this does, of course, something with them, but also with the state. So they install more security cameras. They try to control public space much more than they did before, or they use it as an excuse to have the right to do it now more than they did before, because they get now also more legitimization to do so from their citizen. So if we summarize that a bit, there is kind of a hard way to control and to regulate migrants, and the state relies heavily on the help of citizens, which is quite important. So be vigilant is a message that is sent out by the state. It was just done so, for instance, by the German Interior Minister Thomas de Maizière. I might quote him. He actually said that literally in June of this year, so really recent. Citizens should be more vigilant in fight against terrorism, he says. In a society, we also need increased vigilance if relatives, neighbors, or friends radicalize themselves. Of course, so this is a conflation with terrorism, of course. And he goes on to say that has to be part of our security architecture. Sharing such evidence with authority is essential for thwarting terrorist attack. So in the US, we have other slogans. So if you see something, say something. So stay alert. And you have at the airports constantly those messages, don't leave your baggage alone, and so forth. But it's quite interesting to look at it now really from a very pragmatic point of view. Remember, certainly the Boston attentat, the Boston terror attack in 2013, it was not the security cameras. It was not the thousands of police officers in the space. It was one resident who gave the key tip to the police to arrest the people. You know, so the state relies on vigilant citizens, and that's why this is encouraged. And you have a similar situation in Germany, in Frankfurt in 2015, last year, when the bicycle marathon was cancelled. It was not the police, and it was not the cameras. It was one lady in the shop at the cashier in the hardware store. She said, well, this pair of people, they are buying very strange things in very big quantities, you know. And then she called the police, and that's how they were stopped. So there are a lot of examples, and we could go on and on and on, you know, that this vigilante architecture come into play from below and from above. And I find that quite striking. And I think that also does something with us in cities, in urban spaces, and all those messages that we get. And it is basically the fear of the other. Yeah? And vigilantism can serve also, of course, as a powerful instrument of social exclusion. Because I don't know so well that incident in Frankfurt, but I could imagine it was also racialized. So it's not just the things you buy, who buys what, you observe. And then we could come back now to that whole discussion of racialized border issues, right? That the border is there. It's kind of obvious in that spatial context. So there are many examples that we could mention, but I just wanted to bring that point across. And I have this picture, which I find striking because important are actually not the dominant figures, but the man who is looking out of the window. You know, this is, I want to stress him. It is him on the ground, yeah, that I want to make my point. So the vigilante citizen that kind of is far more effective than state powers, and state kind of is aware of that. So that's why I've chosen that picture. As an anthropologist, I'm now interested what does this do this situation? And I have one research project where I look at how this vigilante discourse affects migrants and people who look like migrants but are not. Are they spaces that they avoid? Are they practices that they appropriate, that they haven't done before? How do you differentiate yourself from that racialized notion of the other, even so you never migrated? You know, so at least here we see those strong linkages between migrants, no, that broad category, and non-migrants. You can't really separate those categories. They are interwoven and they play out in very particular spatial habits, spatial practices, and of course a range of social layers that I just mentioned. So I've taken up too much time anyway, so I will just wrap up really briefly what I want to say, that there is a collective imagination of refugees or migrants respectively. Think of the representation in the media, which I mentioned, or think of also the state powers that I just addressed, but there are also local beliefs regarding otherness. So both layers come together, you know, there is an interplay between those both. Local beliefs regarding otherness might refer also to pollution, to disease, they are dirty, they kind of bring a mess to us that we don't want, and so forth. So I think that list is kind of also obvious to you. So there is an altering relationship between autonomous citizens and the state. This is another point that I would like to make. That refers now to the ethical subject and to the subjectivation process drawing on Foucault's theory. You know, so there is an unintended consequence again in that process that we see, or in that what we call refugee crisis. It affects, of course, very strongly spatial patterns of movements and mobility of both migrants and non-migrants, where you go, where you feel safe, how space is surveillance or not, if you want that or not. So this is kind of the last example I had. And there is that contextual global aspect to it. So it's, I would say, there is an emergence of a new form of citizenship through global mobility, because those processes are happening on a global stage. And even so, I work in the Mexican border more than in the European context. There are a lot of interconnections going on. So there is a global regime that we have to consider when we speak of migration, migrant crises, security, and spatial and social layers that people move through. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.